The day's silence spoke louder than words. The lecture hall buzzed with energy as students filed in, their voices a lively hum of anticipation. Some clutched notebooks, others balanced steaming coffee cups, their chatter weaving into the familiar symphony of campus life. It was just another Tuesday at Whitmore University, a prestigious institution nestled in the heart of Oregon, where intellect thrived and ideas clashed. Within the ivy-covered walls of Room 302, a class on cultural criticism was about to begin. This wasn't just any class. It was taught by Professor Eleanor Grayson, a name synonymous with sharp wit and fearless critiques. Known for her unfiltered commentary on societal norms, Grayson was both admired and infamous. Students packed her lectures, eager for the intellectual fireworks she so often ignited. But today, an unexpected spark would create an entirely different blaze. Seated in the third row, blending into the sea of eager faces, was a young man who appeared as unremarkable as any other student. Barron Trump, tall and poised, kept his head slightly bowed, his plain hoodie and jeans offering an unassuming camouflage. He had enrolled at Whitmore under an assumed name, seeking refuge from the notoriety that came with his family's prominence. For Barron, this university represented something precious: anonymity, the chance to think for himself, and the freedom to define his own path. As the students settled into their seats, Professor Grayson strode to the podium, her commanding presence immediately silencing the room. She surveyed the audience with a sharp gaze, her crisp voice cutting through the residual murmurs. "Good morning," she began. "Today, we delve into public image, how it's constructed, manipulated, and weaponized. We'll use real-life examples to explore its impact on societal norms." Barron shifted slightly in his seat. He wasn't sure what to expect from the lecture, but Grayson's reputation had piqued his interest. He had hoped for an engaging discourse, perhaps even a challenge to his own thinking. But as the lecture unfolded, he found himself bracing for something entirely different. Grayson began weaving a tapestry of cultural critique, dissecting the public personas of various figures with her characteristic precision. Her words were sharp and deliberate, her arguments incisive. The room was captivated, students nodding in agreement or chuckling at her well-placed jabs. But then, her tone shifted. "Take Melania Trump, for instance," she said, pacing the stage with the confidence of someone completely in control. "A woman celebrated for her elegance and poise. But what does that say about our collective standards? Are we so shallow that beauty and silence are virtues worth celebrating?" A murmur rippled through the class. Some students exchanged wary glances. Others nodded, leaning into her critique. Barron felt a subtle tightening in his chest, but kept his face impassive. Grayson continued, her words now dripping with sarcasm. "What about intelligence? Contribution? Influence through substance rather than surface? Is this truly the image we want to hold up for young women today?" Barron stared at the desk in front of him, his mind racing. He had attended this lecture out of genuine curiosity, but now unease crept in. Grayson's critique wasn't just abstract, it felt deeply personal. He knew his mother wasn't perfect. No one was. But the mockery in the professor's tone stung. For years, he had watched his family endure relentless scrutiny, and he had chosen silence. But now, sitting in that room, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: resolve. Grayson didn't stop. She dissected Melania Trump's every move, from her public speeches to her infamous jacket that read, "I really don't care, do you?" The class leaned in, captivated by her razor-sharp commentary. "She's a symbol," Grayson declared, gesturing dramatically. But a symbol of what? Of a bygone era when women were expected to stand silently behind powerful men, to smile prettily and say nothing of substance. Laughter erupted, and Barron felt his hands tighten into fists beneath the desk. He scanned the faces of his peers, some amused, others indifferent, but none seemed to question the one-sidedness of the argument. Yet he stayed silent, unsure if it was fear, respect for the professor, or the weight of being in an environment where his family name was unwelcome. But then Grayson's words struck a final nerve. "Let's not forget the irony," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "A woman whose public statements include gems like 'Be best.' A slogan so grammatically awkward it makes you wonder, does it reflect a lack of understanding or a lack of care?" The laughter was louder this time, a collective release of tension that only deepened Barron's frustration. His heart pounded, not with anger, but with a complex mix of emotions: disappointment, frustration, and a growing sense of responsibility. He took a deep breath, his hand steadying on the desk. Slowly, deliberately, he raised it. The room fell silent. Grayson paused mid-sentence, her gaze narrowing as she spotted him. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped, as though annoyed by the interruption. Barron stood, his movements graceful but firm. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, the laughter evaporating into a charged silence. He spoke calmly, his voice steady but unyielding. "You talk about my mother as if she's just an image, a caricature of societal expectations. But have you ever considered the humanity behind the headlines?" The professor blinked, momentarily caught off guard. A few students exchanged surprised glances, unsure of where this was going. Barron pressed on, his tone measured but firm. "My mother grew up in a small town in Slovenia, in a family that didn't have much. She worked hard to make something of herself, navigating a world where people judged her for everything: her accent, her looks, her past. And yet, she succeeded. She became a model, learned 5 languages, and eventually became the First Lady of the United States. Not because she sought fame or power, but because she believed in her family and her values." A murmur rippled through the room. Some students shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, drawn in by the unexpected depth of his words. Barron's gaze remained locked on Grayson. "You say she represents outdated ideals," he continued. "But maybe the problem isn't her. Maybe it's how we, as a society, decide what's worth celebrating. You criticize her for being quiet, but isn't there strength in choosing your words carefully, in speaking only when you have something meaningful to say?" The room was utterly silent now, the weight of his words settling over the students like a heavy blanket. Even Grayson, known for her quick rebuttals, seemed momentarily stunned. "And let's not pretend," Barron added, his voice unwavering, "that public figures like my mother don't pay a price for everything they do. Every smile, every gesture, every mistake is dissected, mocked, and judged by people who've never walked a day in their shoes. We're quick to tear people down, but slow to consider the cost of living under that microscope." He paused, letting the room absorb his words. For the first time, his classmates saw not just a peer, but someone who carried the weight of experiences they could barely comprehend. Barron sat down quietly, his presence no longer anonymous. He didn't smile or revel in the attention. He looked thoughtful, almost pensive. The room erupted into applause. At first tentative, then growing louder, it was more than just approval. It was a release of tension, an acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just happened. The applause echoed through the lecture hall, filling the space with an energy that felt almost transformative. Barron sat quietly, his expression calm but reflective. He hadn't spoken to win applause or sway opinions. He had spoken because he felt it was the right thing to do. Professor Grayson stood at the podium, her usual commanding presence tempered by a hint of uncertainty. For a moment, she remained silent, her sharp mind processing the unexpected turn of events. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, almost introspective. "Those are compelling points," she admitted, her tone carrying a trace of defensiveness. "But isn't it fair to scrutinize public figures, especially when they occupy roles that influence millions?" Barron met her gaze steadily, his composure unshaken. "Scrutiny is fair," he replied, his voice firm but devoid of hostility. "But what you've done here isn't scrutiny. It's mockery. There's a difference between critiquing someone's actions and tearing down their character. The latter doesn't challenge ideas. It just perpetuates division. Grayson opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Around the room, students exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from impressed to contemplative. The dynamic had shifted, the usual hierarchy of authority and student deference momentarily dismantled. In the back row, a student tentatively raised his hand. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Maybe we are too quick to judge people we don't really know." Another chimed in, her tone reflective. "It's easier to point fingers, but..." He's right. Public figures are still human beings. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, a stark contrast to the laughter that had filled it earlier. Grayson, who had built her career on challenging conventions, now found herself facing a challenge she hadn't anticipated, a critique not of her intellect, but of her approach. The lecture continued, but the energy had shifted irrevocably. Grayson's words, usually sharp and commanding, now carried an undercurrent of introspection. She navigated the remainder of the session with her usual eloquence, but refrained from returning to the topic that had sparked the confrontation. When the class ended, the students filed out slowly, their chatter subdued. Many glanced at Barron as they passed, some offering nods of acknowledgement or murmured words of support. He responded with polite smiles, keen to avoid becoming the center of attention. Ripples beyond the classroom. By the time the lecture hall emptied, the events of the day had already begun to ripple beyond its walls. A student had discreetly recorded part of Barron's response, and the clip quickly found its way onto social media. Within hours, the video was trending, the caption simple but impactful. "When the quietest person in the room changes everything." The video ignited a firestorm of discussion. Comment sections buzzed with debates about public perception, the role of criticism, and the line between analysis and mockery. Some praised Barron for his poise and courage. Others critiqued Grayson for her approach, while a few questioned the validity of defending public figures at all. On campus, the impact was even more profound. Students who had once revered Grayson's unfiltered critiques began to question the ethics of her methods. Informal discussions popped up in cafeterias and dorms, sparking debates about respect, empathy, and the humanity of public figures. Grayson herself was not immune to the ripple effect. That evening, as she prepared for her next class, she found herself replaying Barron's words in her mind. Her usual confidence faltered as she grappled with a realization that had been creeping up on her. For all her intellect and insight, she had overlooked an essential truth. Criticism without empathy, she realized, was hollow. Sitting at her desk, she stared at her lecture notes, suddenly unsure of the arguments she had once delivered with unwavering conviction. Barron's words echoed in her thoughts. What if we shifted the conversation to the values behind the image, instead of tearing down the person? A new chapter. The following week, room 302 was filled to capacity even earlier than usual. The students who arrived chatted in hushed tones, their excitement tinged with curiosity. Word had spread about the confrontation, and many were eager to see how Grayson would address it. The professor entered the room with her usual air of authority, but her demeanor was different, softer, more contemplative. She waited for the room to settle before stepping to the podium. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady but reflective. "Before we dive into today's topic, I want to address something important, something that happened last week." The room grew silent, the students leaning forward in anticipation. "Last week, I was challenged in a way that forced me to reconsider not just my arguments, but my approach to teaching," Grayson continued. "For that, I owe all of you, especially one of you, my gratitude." Her gaze briefly flicked to Barron, who sat in his usual spot. He returned her look with a slight nod, his expression calm but unreadable. "Criticism is important," Grayson said, her tone taking on a reflective edge. It's how we question norms and push for progress. But so is empathy. Without it, our critiques risk becoming shallow and destructive. Last week, I failed to extend that empathy to the subject of my critique. For that, I apologize. The room was silent, captivated by the unexpected humility in her words. Grayson had built her reputation on fearless commentary, yet here she was, openly acknowledging a misstep. Today, I want to approach our discussion differently, she said, her voice gaining strength. Not by tearing down, but by examining the values and complexities that shape public figures. And by extension, ourselves. The lecture that followed was unlike any she had delivered before. It was thoughtful, nuanced, and grounded in the very empathy she had previously overlooked. The students, many of whom had initially idolized her sharp critiques, found themselves inspired in a new way, a legacy of dialogue. For Barron, life on campus continued quietly. He returned to his studies, avoiding the spotlight as much as he could. The viral video brought fleeting attention, but he declined interviews and invitations to speak publicly. His actions had never been about fame or recognition. They were about fairness and standing up for what he believed in. But the impact of his words lingered. On campus, students began to approach discussions with a newfound awareness. The debates sparked by Barron's response challenged them to think critically, not just about public figures, but about their own assumptions and biases. Even Grayson, known for her intellectual bravado, adopted a more balanced approach in her lectures. She encouraged her students to question not just the subjects of their critiques, but the way they engaged with them. The story didn't end in the classroom. The viral clip continued to circulate online, inspiring broader conversations about respect and empathy in public discourse. Commentators, academics, and everyday viewers alike found themselves reflecting on the balance between critique and compassion. As the semester unfolded, the students who had witnessed that pivotal moment carried its lesson with them. For many, it was a turning point, a reminder that courage and conviction, when paired with respect and understanding, could create a ripple effect far beyond their immediate surroundings. The moral of the story. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, it takes courage to stand up for fairness and humanity. Barron Trump's quiet yet powerful intervention was a testament to the idea that respect doesn't diminish critical thought. It enhances it. Even in disagreement, we can choose compassion over mockery, challenging ideas without tearing down the individuals behind them. The question he left the room with lingered long after the applause had faded. Are you challenging the idea, or are you tearing down the person? For those who witnessed the exchange, and for the many more who were inspired by it, the answer became a guiding principle, a reminder of the power of empathy in shaping meaningful dialogue.